He was the most powerful man alive. He commanded the largest army on earth. He owned cities, gold, the lives of millions. There was no desire he could not satisfy, no order he could not give. And late at night, in a war tent on a frozen frontier, he wrote himself a note. He wrote it to remind himself that none of it was his. Not the power, not the gold, not even the next breath. He never meant for anyone to read it. He was not writing a book. He was writing to the one person he could never command, himself. His name was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome. And the strangest thing about the man who had everything is that he spent his nights trying to convince himself he needed none of it. Why would the richest, most powerful man in the world do that? Stay with me. What he understood is something almost no one who chases wealth ever learns in time. To understand what Marcus gave up on the inside, you first have to understand what he held in his hands. In the 2nd century, Rome was the world. Its empire stretched from the deserts of the east to the cold rivers of the north. Tens of millions of people, all of them, in the end, answerable to one man. And by the year 161, that man was Marcus Aurelius. There was no check on him, no parliament, no court that could overrule him. What he wanted built was built. What he wanted destroyed was destroyed. He could take any object, any estate, any life, and no law on earth could stop his hand. He was, in the truest sense the ancient world could offer, a god who had not yet died. Think about what that does to a person. Every desire satisfied before it is even spoken. Every room you enter, falling silent. Every face turning toward you, waiting. Most men spend their whole lives reaching for a fraction of that. Marcus was born into the current that carried him to all of it. And here is the quiet horror underneath the gold. A man who can have anything very quickly discovers a terrible thing. Having it changes nothing. The palace is still just a room. The feast still ends. The power that terrifies everyone around you cannot buy you a single hour of peace when you lie awake at 3 in the morning. Marcus saw this early. He saw the men around him, senators, generals, princes, clawing for exactly the things he already had, certain that on the other side of them was happiness, and he watched them arrive, and he watched them remain empty. So, he asked the question that would define his entire life. If not this, then what? If the whole world is not enough to fill a man, what is? The answer he found did not come from a palace. It came from a slave, and from a way of thinking that Rome had almost forgotten. Marcus never wanted to be emperor. That is the first thing his story asks you to sit with. He was born into a well-placed family, but not the throne. Then, when he was 17, the reigning emperor Antoninus Pius adopted him, and in that single act, the course of his life was sealed. He would rule, whether he wished it or not. For over 20 years, he waited in the shadow of that decision, learning the machinery of an empire he had not asked to inherit. And in those years, something quiet took hold of him. A philosophy. It reached him almost by accident. One of his teachers, a man named Rusticus, handed him the writings of Epictetus, a philosopher who had been born a slave. And the words of that former slave struck the future emperor harder than anything gold could buy. The teaching was simple, and it was ruthless. There are things in your control and things that are not. Your possessions, your body, your reputation, your power. None of these are truly yours. They are on loan. They can be taken in an instant. The only thing that is ever truly yours is how you meet what happens. Your own mind, nothing else. Sit with how strange this was. The most powerful man in the world had quietly accepted a philosophy that told him his power was an illusion, that the empire in his hands was not his, that the only kingdom he would ever really rule was the one behind his own eyes. He did not treat this as a hobby. He treated it as survival. Because Marcus seemed to understand, even young, that the throne coming toward him was not a reward. It was a weight, and a man who believes his crown is who he is will be crushed the moment it is threatened. So he prepared, not to enjoy power, but to carry it without being owned by it. And then the weight arrived. Antoninus died. The empire turned to Marcus. And almost at once, the world he had inherited began to fall apart. Somewhere on the northern frontier, in the middle of a war he did not start, Marcus began to write. Not speeches, not decrees, not history. He wrote short notes to himself in Greek by lamplight at the end of days spent commanding armies and burying the dead. Reminders, corrections, arguments with his own weakness. He gave them no title meant for the public. In the original, they are simply called to himself. We know them today as the Meditations. And the most important fact about that book is this: Marcus never intended you to read it. Understand what that means. Almost every famous book was written to be seen, to persuade, to impress, to last. This one was not. This is the most powerful man in history, alone, talking to himself, with no audience to perform for, no reputation to protect. It may be the most honest document any ruler has ever left behind. And what does the master of the world write to himself when no one is watching? Not how to gain more, how to need less. He writes that fame is smoke. In one passage, he reminds himself that just as new sand buries the old, the events of life bury those before them, that everything he does will be covered over and forgotten. He tells himself that the crowds who might praise his name will themselves be dead within a generation, and those who follow them too until the memory is gone entirely. He writes about death constantly, not with fear, but as a tool. Think of yourself as dead, he tells himself in the 7th book. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. This is a man who could have commanded monuments to his own glory. Instead, he sat in the dark and reminded himself that glory is nothing, that his body would return to the earth like every other, that the only thing worth building was a self that did not depend on any of it. He was not writing to teach the world. He was writing to hold himself together. Because outside the tent, the world was giving him every reason to fall apart. It is easy to write about detachment from a quiet study. Marcus wrote it from inside a catastrophe. Consider what his reign actually was. Almost as soon as he took power, a plague swept in from the east, what we now call the Antonine Plague. It moved through the empire for years and killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people, perhaps 1 in 10 of everyone he ruled. He watched his world empty out, and he could not stop it. At the same time, the northern borders broke open. Germanic tribes poured across the Danube, and Marcus, a scholar at heart, a man who wanted nothing more than to think, spent most of the rest of his life at war. Years in cold camps on the edge of the empire, far from Rome, directing a grinding conflict that would not end until the year he died. And then, betrayal. In the year 175, one of his most trusted generals, Avidius Cassius, heard a false rumor that Marcus had died and declared himself emperor, a man Marcus had elevated, turning against him. The revolt collapsed only because Cassius was killed by his own soldiers. Plague, war, betrayal. the death of his co-emperor. Any one of these could break a person. Marcus faced all of them for nearly 2 decades while carrying the single heaviest office on Earth. And this is the point most people miss about him. His calm was not the calm of an easy life. It was forged in the exact opposite. The meditations are not the gentle musings of a man with nothing to worry about. They are the survival notes of a man drowning in responsibility, using philosophy the way a soldier uses a shield, not for decoration, but to stay alive. He never claimed to have mastered it. That is what makes him believable. Again and again, he writes to himself as a man still struggling, reminding himself not to be angry, not to be corrupted by power, not to blame the world for what it does. He was not a saint standing above it all. He was a man holding the line inside himself, one day at a time. And the hardest test of all was not the plague or the war or the traitor. It was closer to home. And it was the one battle this master of himself would lose. Marcus Aurelius mastered an empire, a plague, and his own mind. He could not master his son. For decades, Rome had been ruled by a quiet miracle. Each of the great emperors before Marcus had chosen his successor not by blood, but by merit, adopting the most capable man he could find and passing the empire to him. It was perhaps the wisest thing Rome ever did. It gave the world the 5 good emperors, and Marcus was the last of them. And Marcus broke it. He had a natural son who survived to adulthood, Commodus. And instead of choosing the best man to follow him, Marcus did the very human thing. He chose his own child. He handed the most powerful position on earth to a young man who had none of his father's discipline and all of a spoiled prince's appetites. We can only guess what was in his heart. Perhaps love. Perhaps he had no real choice. Perhaps the one man who preached that nothing is truly ours could not, in the end, let go of his own boy. But the result was catastrophe. Commodus would become a byword for cruelty and vanity, a ruler obsessed with the exact things his father had spent a lifetime warning against. Historians often mark his reign as the moment Rome's long golden age began to die. There is something almost unbearably human in this. The man who wrote page after page about controlling himself, about not being ruled by desire, about seeing clearly, could not see his own son clearly. The philosophy that saved him could not save the thing he loved most. And Marcus, near the end, seems to have known his time was closing. The plague that had haunted his entire reign came for him too. In the year 180, in a military camp near what is now Vienna, far from the marble of Rome, the emperor of the world lay dying, with Commodus, the son who would undo his legacy, at his side. He had ruled everything, and he was leaving with nothing in his hands, exactly as he had always told himself he would. If you have come this far with me, take a moment and subscribe. This is where we sit with these lives every week, quietly, without the noise. Then stay, because what happened after Marcus closed his eyes is the strangest part of all. Picture the scene. Not a palace, not a golden hall, a military camp on the cold edge of the empire, the air thick with sickness, the frontier still unquiet. The most powerful man in the history of the world is dying in a tent, and there is no evidence that he was afraid. For his entire adult life, Marcus had rehearsed this exact moment on the page. He had told himself over and over that death was not a punishment, but a natural thing, as ordinary as being born, as necessary as the turning of a season. He had written that to fear death is to demand that the universe make an exception for you, and he had refused to make that demand. Everything he had spent his nights preparing for came down to this 1 hour. The gold could not come with him. The empire could not come with him. The name Marcus Aurelius, which terrified the known world, would soon be just a sound, spoken by people who had never seen his face. He had known this all along. That is what the whole private book had been for, not to make him a better ruler, to make him ready to lose everything without flinching, because he understood, more clearly than almost anyone before or since, that losing everything is the one appointment no man escapes. The richest, most powerful man alive died the same way the poorest slave in his empire died. And he had spent his life making sure he knew it. But his story does not end in that tent. Because the one thing Marcus never tried to keep, the one thing he never valued, never promoted, never meant for anyone's eyes, is the only thing of his that survived. Everything Marcus Aurelius owned is gone. The empire fell. The palaces are ruins. The gold was melted and scattered across centuries. The armies are dust. His own son squandered the world he inherited within a few years. If you measure a man by what he accumulated, then Marcus, like every emperor, lost it all. Except for one thing: the private notebook, the words he scratched to himself by lamplight, the ones he never intended anyone to read, the ones he placed no value on at all, outlived the entire Roman Empire. Nearly 2,000 years later, they are still in print, still read, still carried in the pockets of soldiers and students and people lying awake at 3 in the morning all over a world Marcus never knew existed. Sit with the irony of that. The gold he was handed vanished. The power he was given decayed. The empire he protected crumbled. And the only treasure that remained was the one he built for free, in the dark, trying to convince himself that none of the gold mattered. He spent his life as the richest man in the world, quietly practicing to need nothing. And in the end, the nothing he practiced is the only thing of his we still have. He never told you what the lesson was. He would not have. He would simply have reminded himself one more time that the applause fades, the sand covers the sand, and the only wealth a man truly keeps is who he became while he had everything to lose. Then he would have closed the book and gone back to work. If this stayed with you, subscribe and share it with one person who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments which line stayed with you. And come back next week. There is another life and another quiet truth about wealth waiting in the dark.